Hello and good evening, I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Now, it's been almost a week since Budget 2021 was tabled in the Dewan Rakyat, and so far we've heard reactions from politicians from both sides of the aisle. We've heard from economists and also from industry interests. But let's hear now from a person who is central to the formulation of the budget. Tonight on the show, we welcome Johan Merican. He's the Director of the National Budget Office under the Ministry of Finance. Welcome to the show, Johan. Good evening.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the reactions to Budget 2021. I mean, there had been some criticism that Budget 2021 had fallen short of expectation. And this is not just from politicians who might be accused of grandstanding, but also from, public health experts, from business groups, from economists. So help us understand, Johan, the thinking of government behind the drawing up of Budget 2021. What were the assumptions made by government about the longevity and the severity of the pandemic and the economic crisis ensuing?
Thank you, Melissa. I think first, let's put Budget 2021 in context. I think never before has our country or even the world has faced something like the COVID crisis. It's a health crisis combined with a financial economic crisis. And I guess you also need to look at Budget 2021 as a continuity to the stimulus packages that have been announced prior to this, the Prihatin, Bencana, Kita Prihatin, and then Budget 21. So certainly on one hand, there is the COVID-19 crisis, first and foremost, top of mind, and what do we need to do to prioritize for the country to overcome COVID-19. But of course, at the same time, part of a budget is really how much can you afford, and so it's really that fine balancing act. And certainly, I think it's something. It's not unusual. It's not something new. Of course, every year we have many stakeholders to please, and I guess being in the Ministry of Finance, I think every year, obviously, there are people who are not happy. But I think certainly there are certain things that I think we did right in Budget 2021. And I think we anchored Budget 2021 on three major objectives: the Rakyat's well-being, continuity of business, and also economic resilience. And I think we satisfy all three, but with a really special emphasis really towards the Rakyat. And I think that's the angle which needed greatest emphasis in this current environment. And I think to some extent that's where also we've prioritized our resources.
Right. So it's fine. I mean, you've kind of stated the government's case, and I want to come back to the critics that Melissa mentioned, because there are many sides of the aisle. The aisle is actually multiple at this point of our political history, right? And so you had criticism coming not just from Pakatan Harapan, but also from the Barisan Nasional, which supports the government of the day. And I know you're not a politician. I mean, this is very clear to us. So to help us understand things like the revenue projection, because there was some debate about that, and that these were overly optimistic. Before we get to the spending, the revenue collection aspect of it, help us understand that. What do you say to your critics?
We would like to say that the Ministry of Finance has been doing the budget for decades, and we've not done anything differently. We've always anchored our budgets on what we believe are realistic assumptions. Certainly, what would perhaps be an issue, I guess, would be everyone knowing that this particular year has been obviously a very challenging year, and that obviously would have impact on our tax collections. I think that to some extent has been factored in to our projections. In fact, the sort of level of taxes, I think even that we're factoring in for next year are even just probably comparable to even 2019. And as a percentage of GDP, it's basically on a consistent basis to what has been experienced in 2019. 2020, we call it almost an anomaly. So in that sense, it's consistent. And certainly what we typically would do, and if it's been happening in Budget 2019, Budget 2020, certainly we also then have to optimize on non-tax revenues as well, coming from government agencies and companies. So it's a combination of that, and we believe that we stand behind our numbers as being based on the best available information that we have.
Does the MOF and the Cabinet have a conservative mindset when it comes to projections, when it comes to thinking about fiscal discipline, for instance, or even policy measures?
I think what the government has demonstrated is an ability to be, I think in the words of our minister, has said that 2021 is an expansionary budget. First, think back in terms of 2020 in itself. When we presented Budget 2020, that was still based on the premise that we were trying to then achieve greater fiscal consolidation. Budget 2020 was presented on the basis of a fiscal deficit of 3.2%. With the stimulus packages that have been announced, Budget 2020 will now be almost at 6%, almost double of what was previously announced. And again, going into next year, it's not like we're immediately contracting. The fiscal deficit remains at 5.4%, although on an absolute amount, the expenditure actually has risen. The fact that it's gone from 6 to 5.4 is a function that next year we're projecting between 6.5% to 7.5% GDP growth. So even while the absolute number of deficit, it's about comparable, but obviously it reduces a bit. So it's still, I wouldn't call it conservative. We're certainly responding to a need of being, in a difficult economic situation where the government has to show leadership and continue to spend and help those places in need.
But I just want to kind of follow up on that. The comments that this was a timid budget, that it wasn't bold, and what we really need in a time of crisis. And many comments have pointed out that it's because this government is looking over its shoulder. Was that holding the government back in putting forth a bold budget to deal with what is clearly an extraordinary time?
Okay, perhaps apologies if I potentially sounds a bit defensive. I think the government has done something quite extraordinary even during 2020. It's announced, I think, stimulus package after another, I think never before, ever in our economic history, a combined stimulus package worth, including fiscal and non-fiscal, talking about 300 billion fiscal stimulus, which is as much as an annual budget. I think perhaps, if anything, perhaps maybe the reaction is perhaps the inability that we continue to announce 100 billion stimulus to then add on. I think that perhaps could be the only thing, but I think we've done things we've never done before. Large wage subsidies, unprecedented cash transfers to the lower income. At least that's from our perspective. But
if I could just ask you about that, because I think I think often the critics are also comparing us to other countries, to Singapore, or to stimulus packages you see in Europe and such. And I don't know if those comparisons are fair, but they tend to be deeper and longer in what they were promising to their population in terms of wage support, and not so here, right? So the series of support packages comes as a consequence of very short-term measures, I think, that some critics point to. How do you bring your critics over to your side? What exactly you're telling them so that they see it from your perspective?
I think we are trying to respond we're almost responding as the need arises. I think if you look back to even as we started this journey, even with the stimulus package, we recognized that certainly there was a need to address, particularly in terms of preservation of jobs. There was a wage subsidy introduced, and as
but
we
it
then
wasn't for very long, was it?
It was a limited
introduced for 3
period,
months.
right?
No, so what we do is that we basically announce it, and the wage subsidy as it stands, it's already something that's going to be allocated about 16 billion. That's compared to it's only that one line item alone is almost 5% of our annual budget. And I guess we saw fit that, I think with the challenge, and maybe just to share an anecdote, when we were in MOF back in February, when we were first starting on the first stimulus package, and then at that point in time we announced a 10 billion package, and at that time the thinking was, this COVID thing, it's not as serious as SARS, perhaps it should be done within 3 months. And
this is in February.
That is obviously in February, and obviously
before the Perikatan National Government.
Yes, so that was announced, and obviously very soon the severity of COVID-19 dawned upon, which is why then you see this transition from the initial stimulus and why under Tan Sri Muhyiddin the stimulus under Prihatin was manifold, the original, and as I guess one listeners would then have to appreciate it. We are responding as the situation unfolds. And at that point in time, what we saw was that even at that time, we didn't know how long it was. So I guess that's why then these systems would tend to be targeted towards the ones that needed it most. And we then said, okay, this is how much is needed now. And as we go along, we reassess. And then we saw there was a need for more. We then restarted Penjana again, and then followed by Kita Prihatin, and we continued to reassess our position. And I guess maybe one thing to highlight from the budget was we have announced allocation of 322 billion ringgit. At the same time, Minister of Finance has also announced that we're also planning to then also go back to Parliament to ask for an increase in the COVID fund. You know, the COVID fund which was approved back in August. And at that time, some called, said, you know, why only 45? And said, well, the measures that we identify add up to 45 billion. But at that time, the minister did say, you know, if the situation requires, we'll come back. And so we're coming back asking for an additional 20 billion, and that 20 billion includes shall we say, a contingency of 10 billion over and above what's been allocated in budget 2021. So also then gives us further room to then be able to spend according to the need that arises.
All right, let's come back to the allocations under budget 2021, and we're going to take a quick break, but we'll come back and discuss more on Consider This. Stay tuned. If you've just joined us, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan. And we're speaking tonight to Johan Merican, the National Budget Office Director at the Ministry of Finance. Johan, let's talk a little bit about the allocations under budget 2021. The JASA allocation, the more than 80 million ringgit JASA allocation, that's whether justified or not, stole a lot of the thunder of budget 2021. And I wanted to ask you, at this point in time, I know that you're following all the debates that are happening in Dewan Rakyat. Is there still room for an adjustment in the allocations at this point in time?
And who asked for it, starters?
Well, okay, I must confess, I don't even immediately recall, but certainly there has been a lot of, and certainly not just in Parliament, but also certainly on the social media. I know it, as you said, does steal a little bit of a thunder, something which is 80 million in the context of a 300 billion budget, but certainly
but
it has.
For what it was allocated for, I think that was why there was such an outrage.
Yes. I mean, it was a decision at the ministry level to re-establish JASA, which they felt was a component in which to explain basically government policies at a grassroots level. The number is actually comparable to what was then provided in previous time, 2018 and before.
Yeah, but do you appreciate the optics of it? Because I think, and I don't know if your office can anticipate such things, and tell us if that is not your concern. But the optics was that these were skewed priorities in a time of crisis for something that could have been handled by the communications department rather than needing a separate propaganda unit, which is how it was framed.
Yes, I think maybe that's, you know, probably beyond the remit of the budget office, that just looks in terms of the ceilings that we give to each ministry and then how they then allocate it within those ministries' requirements. Sorry,
so you said it was comparable to the previous budget? It's a 185% increase. Did that not concern you?
No, I think that there's a misunderstanding. I mean, there was obviously reported in the media that previously it was 20 million. Actually, it's always been in the neighborhood of 80 million. It was just maybe it's a classification issue. I mean, previously the allocation for JASA was appearing in more than one place, and it was only picking up one part of.
Okay, let's talk about classification, because I think that also seemed to be a problem for a discussion around the health budget.
Yes.
So help us understand what is going on with the health budget. Why was this so difficult for a lot of your critics to appreciate?
Okay, so it's actually the health budget was very unfortunate. I think bottom line, we just need to focus on the fact that the overall allocation has increased. There's been no cuts in the health budget. I think what again was unfortunate was how the coding or a portion of the budget was just coded in a different portion. So basically what you had was that under Perubatan or medical departments, you had all the different specializations, oncology, nephrology, and you had the allocations set aside. The only difference was that for 2021, the portion relating to medicine and consumables was taken out and pooled in a separate line item in our budget. So there's a separate line item. In fact, there are two line items. One called medicine, and that's almost 2.9 billion. And then there's another line item for the concession, the supply stores concession for So adding up those two line items, it was 4.3 billion that was just set aside as a separate line item. This was, it's really an accounting issue. It was something discussed with Ministry of Health, really how to then just manage the code for medicine and consumables on a separate basis.
Okay.
But once you reallocate, if you had to then try to do on a like-for-like basis, reallocate the medicine component back to those individual departments, actually none of the departments would face a reduction.
Right, so even though there was no breakdown in terms of medical discipline, there was no reduction in each of these categories, is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So there's no reduction. It's just that what happened was that the year before, that department has its budget including medicine. This year, it's the budget excluding medicine because all the individual department medicine had been pooled in a separate line.
And this was done in consultation with the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Health.
Yes, something that we did.
Right. And you coordinate the different ministries in terms of their budget demands or wish list.
It is in the budget office of the Ministry of Finance.
Yeah, I want to bring in stakeholders outside that system who are saying that this year we should have seen not just a holding that it should be the same as last year, but it should be an over-investment, right? So this is the Malaysian Health Coalition's critique, is that we should have seen reflected in the budget for health understanding of a long kind of under-investment in health that has been revealed by the crisis and also an uneven distribution of investment in health. How do you make sense of that critique? Because it's saying that, yes, you might have given, you might give as much this year as you did last year, but the problem is you should have been giving much, much more this year, and that should be really the direction of that government goes in terms of health.
Okay. So I think it comes back to, again, what we can afford, and really we're trying to optimize whatever we have within those constraints, and certainly it is actually been a long ongoing issue that many people have highlighted, that we typically spend about 30 billion on our Ministry of Health, which is a little bit over 2% of our GDP, which compares relatively lower compared to some other jurisdictions. Certainly, if the question is, do we have room to should we directionally be going up? Certainly I think no one would dispute that. However, I think in the context of, let's say, Budget 2021, what we've done is that within a normal budget, we've basically allocated as much. There's a modest increase, but basically as much for Ministry of Health. But what we've done is that over and above the normal budget, the requirements of the COVID are provided over and above that. So maybe for appreciation, the budget book is basically for the standard operating expenditure and development expenditure. As you know, we've created the separate COVID fund for expenses related to the fighting the COVID. So under there, for example, this year we've provided already 1.8 billion for the different ministries, and most of it has been going to Ministry of Health. Next year, as the Minister announced in his speech, there'll be additional 1 billion for helping the requirements of COVID in terms of reagent, consumables, PPE. So that's over and above. That's set aside within the COVID fund. And we've also, within this contingency that the Minister has announced, the 20 billion, he's also announced that there's a commitment to procure vaccines if and when it comes about, and if there's any further requirements, that also will be taken up through the COVID fund. So in that respect, the business as usual carries on, but whatever that's required to fight COVID, we are committed to provide whatever is required.
Right. So then the critique says, the critique is that it's not sufficient to just do that. We need to build back better, right? That's the slogan now. And the slogan means that the public health system, COVID aside, needs also to have much more in terms of investment. Is that the thinking of government as well, or is that something that they're deferring for another year?
There are probably many things that we would love to do if we could, but I think, we worked, maybe just the context of how we work the budget. So we work within what is the frame in which we can spend. We've pushed. I think we've already pushed the limits in terms of what we can do within our current credit rating to push it to 6% in 2020. And we think that the target that we've set for next year, 5.4%, is again within a level of what we can optimize in terms of our total expenditure. And within that limit, what we've done is really to see then, first, we have our commitments, in terms of operating expenditure commitments, and then beyond that, really within the priorities of what we need to fight COVID, in terms of whether it's the Ministry of Health requirements, social assistance, assisting businesses, between these two, there probably isn't as much space to do structural reforms in other spaces, because these are priorities really have to be focused on.
Okay, because the budget is a year. You're looking at 1 year's
Yes.
worth, right? Okay.
Yeah, so and you mentioned credit ratings, right? And this is very interesting because there are, economists like Johan Mahmood Merican and all that said, stop looking at the credit rating agencies and how they look at Malaysia, that these rating agencies and what they do play a disproportionate role in our thinking about how the fiscal space that we have to play. So, and that's where I think the criticism of being overly cautious and so on come in. Do you take that criticism that actually Malaysia could expend much more in terms of its fiscal space for play?
Yes, this is, I guess, something that's always debated. Do you listen to this credit rating? Is the credit rating fair? Does it reflect, at a time when the country is of need, why do you then have to worry about credit rating? I think the thing that perhaps we are concerned by is that if the credit rating was something that just affected the federal government, and maybe, if we then were put down a notch that the only impact of a credit rating would then just be on federal government, I think then perhaps we would be a bit more liberal. But in terms of a credit rating, its implications are actually to everyone. The moment the credit rating is reduced, it increases basically the cost of government borrowing.
Right.
It then knocks on to corporate borrowings, and then if bonds get downgraded, it also leads to an outflow of funds, which also has an impact on exchange rates. So I think that is why we are always, even though I think we've been quite, not say liberal, but certainly we've been quite aggressive in actually ensuring that the expenditure or the budget remains an expansionary by having the highest ever allocation in our budget. But it is still a balancing act that we feel is necessary, because if we overdo it, it'll end up hurting the man on the street more, because in terms of his housing loans, in terms of the cost of doing business, which already are hurting through the crisis. So I think that's where sometimes we have this judgment, I guess, of having to balance between these factors.
Johan, in the time that we have left, I want to shift the conversation to social assistance under Budget 2021. So Budget 2021 proposed Bantuan Prihatin Rakyat. So there were several measures of cash transfers under this budget. But there was also quite a number of EPF-related measures. And I wanted to point to that, the EPF-related measures, whether these EPF-related measures can be effective in safeguarding the welfare of low-income and marginalized households. We're thinking about more than 60% of households who have, less than, if I'm not mistaken, more than 50% have less than 12,000 in their EPF account once. 32% of EPF contributors have less than 5,000 ringgit. This is clearly not a lot of you can see that over 60% of working age Malaysians don't even have EPF accounts. How are you going to address the fact that this measure, while it may sound like you're providing some kind of social safety net, is actually not going to affect a large percentage of vulnerable Malaysians?
I think that's why the Prime Minister and also the Minister of Finance, in looking at vulnerable groups, actually the focus really has been on the cash assistance. So if you look then at, in terms of the Bantuan Prihatin that has been done over and above the Bantuan Sara Hidup, the Bantuan Prihatin alone this year, there was first BPN 1, which was 11.5 billion, and then followed up by BPN 2, which is 7 billion. So that's a cash transfer benefiting 10.6 million recipients, spreading over B40 and M40, in addition to the Bantuan Sara was 5 billion. So even shifting over to Budget 2021, we start off from the bottom. We first looked at the welfare payments. Those are the 400,000 odd households which are below the poverty rate. We tremendously increased the welfare payments from a budget of 1.5 billion to 2.2 billion, increasing the rate substantially. Then the next stage is the Bantuan Sara Hidup. It looks at the B40, and that again was increased from 5 billion to 6.5 billion to help that group. When you're then starting to talk about, looking at EPF, you're absolutely right. I mean, EPF really is for the working person, and really perhaps at a higher level. And to some extent, what was already done in 2020, one is the reduction in the minimum contribution rate
Yes.
from 11% to 7%. You know, over 70% benefit from that this year. It translates to about an additional 700 million of take-home pay increase on a monthly basis. We actually think that the situation is slightly improving, and that's why for next year it's moderated from 11% from 7% up to 9%. And even then, that potentially can equate to an additional 9 billion, which benefits, I would say, at least the 7 million.
Just to be clear, for the most marginalized low-income households, it is the BP, the Bantuan Prihatin Rakyat. That is what is going to support them and carry
Yes.
them through this difficult time.
So even as you mentioned that, if I think currently the debate is saying that for those who are unemployed, then they need to basically take out of account one. But you notice that in the budget we then say, okay, you can't rely on that. That's why we've enhanced the employment insurance payout to make sure that they're able to tide over for the months that are unemployed, and also we've beefed up in terms of the hiring incentive and the reskilling to ensure that how can we help them ensure they get jobs so that, again, they'll be able to at least make ends meet.
Time is up, time has run out, unfortunately, and we could go on talking for
There are
Yes.
so many questions.
Yes. But
There's so many answers that I haven't gotten to.
But thank you.
It's so
for being on the
unfair.
show.
We must have you back.
Thank you for being on the show tonight. We appreciate
Yes.
your time. That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thanks so much for watching. Good night.